Hi everybody, this is our second session on teaching for all and what I call reimagining inclusive education and looking at through our frameworks for learning. And in the last session we looked at 5 frameworks, and now we're going to look at the next 5 and also focus very much on some ideas for the classroom that I hope will be helpful for you. Now, just to recap, because in this first slide, as I've said, everywhere in the world, the adoption of inclusion and inclusive practices is what we're supposed to be doing. But I think the big issue is how do we ensure that all our learners are engaged, once they're actually in the classroom. And as I've said previously, what we're going to look at is what I'd call good practice. Now, it might be that a lot of these things you're doing already, and I'm sure you are. That's what I call the good news. But maybe just seeing them in terms of how all the frameworks link with each other might be helpful for you in your classrooms. And if you can see here the slide here, what we're going to look at is the bottom 5 frameworks. You'll see all 10 in the image on the right hand side, but on the left hand side. So the 5 frameworks we're looking at now is what we call start and link from what learners already know. We're going to look at what we mean by actually scaffolding, and then how in practice can we differentiate in the classroom? What does it mean actually as well? We're going to, and linking to that very much, we're going to look at what we call multi-sensory approaches, and then we're going to look at an assessment and what we call assessment for learning. So that's the five frameworks that we're going to focus on in this session. Okay, now if you see in this first slide, what do I mean by start from what is already known? I think it's kind of common experience for everyone that we learn best when we link we link new information to things that we've already learned. Otherwise, new information will just be in isolation and often isn't meaningful. So, in as much as possible, it's really thinking, well, what do our learners know already, and then how can we add to that and build our understanding. Now, if you look in the top right-hand image, there's a little image about I'm teaching somebody to whistle, and then saying I can't hear him whistling, and the answer is, well, I didn't say he'd learnt it. And of course there's a big gap between something we as a teachers, what we teach, and what our learners actually learn, and I'm not sure we all really understand what that process is, and it's very uneven. But the point is that there is a gap, and I think and some people will get things quite quickly, and others will take longer, and others need to do it in different ways. But I think we just need to understand that teach something is not the same as having learnt something. Now, a good way we can link what we know already is also through working on our special interests, because things that we're really interested in, we're more likely to find meaningful, and more likely to engage in. And so it might be doing things using laptops and iPads and the internet and things like that. It might be might be things in the subject of the lesson that really helps to kind of reinforce. But as I say, just the basic principle is linking to what we know already. Now, let me give you an example how this might work in the English classroom. As a little activity. You'll see in this next image, there's a lot of animals and body parts and all sorts here. And this activity is called monsters. And one way you might do this, let's say you have had a lesson on parts of the body, and which might be in most course books, and you might want to build the vocabulary and reinforce the vocabulary. One way of doing this is asking the learners to take pieces of paper and cut them into little strips, and ask the learners to write a different body part on each strip of paper. So it might be a finger, an eye, an arm, or whatever, yeah, a leg, a toe, a tooth, and things like that. In adding a bit of humour to it, I also say that they can write down parts of animals, parts of the body, as well, just to give it a bit more interest. Now, what we then do is, so if every learner in the class has written 3 parts of the body or 5 parts of the body, you take all these strips of paper in and you put them into a bag, and then you put the learners in groups, and then you give them whole bunches of those words back. Yeah, and the first thing they have to do is they have to kind of see what they've got. And then they could have options. Either they could actually draw what they've got, and of course, if they've got 1 eye, 3 heads, 1 toe, one teeth, and of course they may have internal organs as well. So they have to draw exactly what they've got and the numbers of what they've got, and so they're creating a monster. Yeah, now. You could have an alternative to drawing. Maybe you could use, they could actually model it as well. They can use what we call actually plasticine or something, and they can actually build their monster instead of drawing, just to give a different way of doing it. And then once they've actually drawn their monster, they can do something. Maybe they have a day in the life of their monster. Yeah. And so this is just one little activity. You can see examples of monsters on this slide that they might produce. Again, it's different learners will know different parts of the body. Some will know more than others. It's trying to see, well, what's been taught, has that begun to be processed and learned, and it's just doing it in a slightly different way from just, well, let's have a vocabulary list. Let's try and remember how many words for parts of the body as we can. But actually, you're actually using those words in practice to actually do something meaningful. And that's just one example. Yeah. Now the next one, I actually said that scaffolding was one, and differentiation was another one. But actually, they're very closely linked, and I regard them as actually sisters, in fact, of the same process. And really it's about how do we structure our lessons. Now, if you're not sure what scaffolding is, you can see the image in the top left-hand corner. It's scaffolding a building. Yeah? It's creating a frame. And then are there other different ways that we can do things that can support our learners? Now, how do we structure our learning so we support our learners step by step? And how do we do things and make sure that, well, they're engaged and they seem to be learning, and then can we go on to the next step and the next step, and some learners will be able to run up those steps. Other learners will need to might need to crawl. Other learners will take their decision. They might go quickly on some and slower on others. But it's a kind of way of structuring. It's also a way of kind of creating pathways as well to actually support their learning. I like to say that learning and therefore inclusive practices is very much like going up a mountain. If you like, the learners who appear to be the ones achieving, can make real choices. They can either go up the mountain through the kind of rock face, they might go up the ice face, or they might just take a gentle stroll up. But they seem to know what's best for them and the best way to do it. Other learners who really aren't necessarily achieving, they need much more support in terms of what they do, and they may likely go up the easy way up, but they may also not reach the summit. And in fact, it might be that not everyone reaches the summit, but you can make choices. But I think scaffolding is not just about structuring, because in some respects, structuring can lock the learner in as well. And I think this little image here probably explains it. A bird sitting on a tree is never afraid of the branch. And because the reason they're not afraid of the branch, they're not because their resources are going to be, the bird is going to be their wings, and so they'll feel happy that they can fly. And I think the question of scaffolding is getting our learners to that position. Yes, let's support them, let's give a structure, but let's give the space where they can engage in their own learning and make their own choices. And I think that's what's important in terms of scaffolding. Now we're going to move on to look at differentiation. Now, there's been a lot written about this in magazines, in articles, in books, on webinars, on Teaching English websites and many other websites, and almost all of it very useful and very, very important. And so there's lots of different ways that we as teachers can differentiate in the classroom. It might be that what we ask the learners to do, a task, it's possible to give different learners different levels of task. It might be it's the nature of the information, the content of the lesson. It might be that it's some of the ways that we do things. It may be using what's often called self-access materials, where you may have actually different kinds of activities in different levels and grades, and you might put it on a green, amber, yellow, or red in terms of how easy or hard something might be for a learner. But I think all this is really important, and what we want to avoid, of course, is that a teacher is actually preparing 30 different lesson plans or 50 different lesson plans, or depending on the class of the actual size of the class. I think we need to realise that as teachers we all do a great job, but we also have a life outside of school as well. And I think there's an approach to differentiation that can really, we need to shift the emphasis of who does it from us as teachers to the learners, and that what our job is to create ways that our learners can make their own choices in what we mean by differentiation, or more importantly, what they mean by it as well. Now, let me just give you one example. Now, if we look at this next slide, you'll see we have a kind of a number of different little images. Now, the way I often work with this is I start off on the board or using a flip chart with a blank piece of paper, and on the left-hand side I do a little drawing, and I draw. If you looked in the bottom left-hand side, now you may not know what this is. This might be a house, it might be a face, it could be anything, but I kind of mean it as the outside of a house. And then I put on a chimney, and I put on some smoke coming out, and then I have a little river that's running out from the house. And after that, I then ask learners in the class to come and add things to make up the drawing. And here we've got an example of what people have drawn, but it could be anything. Now, this takes us back a little bit to kind of scaffolding, because I've kind of started the drawing, and that's my scaffolding. But then I've kind of handed over what's going into this, and I call this a text. It's actually a visual text, and it's a text that we can now work with. And I've actually handed this over because it's become the learner's drawing, because they have actually produced most of it now. And now we can work with almost anything from this drawing. It might be vocabulary, and we might just name what we have here in the drawing. Or we might actually, let's take, for example, this is a house on the left-hand side. We might go into the house and might say, well, what different rooms are there in the house? What do we find in the different rooms? What do we find in the living room? What items of vocabulary? What do we find in the kitchen? What might we find in a bathroom? And what may we find in different bedrooms? And so different learners will actually have come up with more information. Some will come up with a little, others will come up with more. But you're actually dealing with the same sort of lesson, but you're differentiating in practice. You might do this with, this might become a story. We might do this by we might work at a very basic level. We might work with actually prepositions. But if you ask the question, when did this happen? Was it last week? Was it yesterday? Is it now in the present? Is it next week? We can work with any point of grammar and tense as well. So again, we can work with different sorts of levels. But different learners can engage with this in their own way, in different ways. So if somebody writes a story, some might just write a few lines. Others might write what I call a French novel. But it kind of allows them to engage at a level that they can achieve in. Now, this kind of approach is also very useful for us as teachers as well, because as you know, it might be that you go into school and you find that one of the teachers isn't there, and maybe they're on a teacher training course, but maybe they're ill, or maybe for whatever reason they couldn't be bothered going into school today, and you have to substitute. Now you think, oh well, what do I do now? You might choose something like this that's quite easy to do, because the learners are doing a lot of the work. But what you need to do is think about how you're going to use it, and I think that's the great use of teachers' time in terms of thinking about differentiation. What really matters is again how you engage the learners in doing things in ways that are meaningful for them, and that's my example. That's one example. What I think is when we're talking about differentiation in terms of the learners making the choices, but still working to similar outcomes. And I think that's what's important. You may have heard of Bloom if you look at this next slide. And now there's kind of 6 aspects to ways we engage in learning in terms of understanding and understanding something, remembering something, then actually how we might analyze some language, or how we might apply it, how we might. I'll come on to talk about evaluation and what learners can do in a few minutes, but how we can create something, and for example, from this visual text, how we can create that into very, very different things in different ways. This is just an approach to thinking how we can have one particular text, one particular, what seems like one activity, but then doing many, many things with it, and how we might engage different learners in this. Now, if you look at the next slide, again, it's just a little outline, what we might call a mapping of how you might look at your own, whether it's the lesson of the day, your actual syllabus, or your lesson plan, and how you might just look at it to how you can create different options to how you exploit what you want to do on that day. And I think that's the strong message of differentiation. How do you do this in a way that ensures in as much as you can that you're reaching all your learners, and that they're able to see some progress in what they're doing. Okay, now the next slide again just kind of reinforces this, and you just might like to look at this. And I think one of the important issues in this as well is how can we avoid, when we're putting people in groups, that we put them in groups just on the level of what they, again, to avoid this sift and sort them into to levels of what you think they can do, ability levels. And can we think of different ways that will group people so that they can bring to the group the things they can do and the strengths they can do, which might be based on grouping people according to a range of interests. It might be previous experience. It might be a group where there are certain things that are quite alike, and then other things that are different. And then how can you actually think about what the outcomes that they're going to make in those groups? And again, coming back to this point about let's really focus on what learners can do rather than what they can't do. And I think that's going to bring a lot more interest into groups, and of course ensuring that everyone has a role. And there is kind of good practice that groups should be relatively small if everyone is going to be engaged, and I think that really matters as well. Now, linked to this is really our NICS framework, which is what I call multisensory and multimodal approaches. And you can see by this the image we're talking about. We use our senses in life, so it just seems obvious that we lose our senses in learning. And again, this is not about trying to box people into learning styles. It's nothing to do with that. A lot of that has been, that, well, you seem to be a visual learner, you need visual activities. You like to listen, so we'll give you what we call auditory activities. You're going to like movement. It's about ensuring that we have a variety of options and different ways of doing things, and that we present through a variety of options, but we give our learners options and choices and how they might actually respond. Now, as part of multi-sensory, I also regard what we might call linguistic. There are learners who really do actually appreciate and need to work through text, and so text and doing things that are remembering is actually very, very important as well. So it's the widest range of options as possible, really. And I think a lot of this is to do with what we call, how do we work with, we don't divide our learners into what we call smart and not non-smart. And, the achieving ones and the non-achieving ones. Now, we're all going to achieve in certain things and less so in other things. Now, I also call this, let's actually promote the aesthetic rather than the anesthetic. And, we want to wake our learners up. And a lot of this could be done through using multisensory approaches and using actually what you might call actually creative arts as well. So engaging in drawing, using music, using all sorts of different approaches that will actually engage our learners. Another little example I'd like to give to this is you might have a lesson, and we'll all have a lesson around this, is looking at a sentence and looking at word order and maybe looking at kind of syntax. Now, you could do this by putting a sentence up on the board and trying to say, well, what's an adjective, what's an adverb, what's a noun, what's a verb, etc. Now, for some learners, that they would want to analyze that sentence, and that might work well. For others, it will just be completely meaningless, and it won't have any sense. So, an alternative of ways of doing this, and I'll just explain this to you, is actually to focus on syntax and word order, but also to focus on actually intonation and actually pronunciation as well. And we could do many things with this. Now, the way I do this is that I give either I give everybody, well, it depends on the size of your class. If you've got 30 in a class, you can't have a sentence really with 30 words. But you can take maybe a 14-word sentence and have some of the class doing it in practice, and then the others are watching and engaging, and they'll have their role later. And you'll see that I've actually put every part of the sentence in a different shade in colour. So an article has a certain colour, an adjective has a colour, and the noun has a colour. And I've given people what you might think is a sentence without much meaning, but it is in terms of the structure of the sentence and the grammar, it's correct. And this sentence says the laughing cat sleeps happily as the dog eats under the bed. Now, what happens is the number of learners, one word for each learner, and they come to the front, and they've probably seen the sentence on the board, and then you take that away. You kind of rub it off, and then they have to come up and they have to make the sentence physically in the order of the words, and people get it. They talk about it and discuss it. Does that go there? Does this go there? What's the right order? Now, if they haven't made the right order, maybe others in the class can say, no, you need to look at this again, and you need to place yourself with the right in the right word order. And once they have got that, then you ask them to actually read out the sentence word by word. And of course, what happens is, and this happens whether they're elementary learners or whether they're more advanced learners, the first time they read out the sentence, they read it as individual words. And so they go, So you say, well, let's look at this. Can we look at the rhythm of the sentence? Can we look at the intonation? And so we go back, and then they work on, they kind of work on that. And of course, the more they do it, the better it is. We can work with lots of emotions around this. You know, could you say the sentence happily? Could you say it sadly? Could you say it, how do you feel after you've had a test? Or you can, there could be all sorts of other options as well. And so you get different sorts of intonation there and different sorts of stress as well. Once you've done that, say, well, can you rearrange yourself so that the words are in a different order, but it still has to be the right, what we call English structure as well. So they move around and they move in and out, and they make a different sentence. And maybe you'll bring out a different 14 people to do that if you want to engage the class. Now, I think the point about this is this is an example of doing what you might do anyway in the class, but doing it in a multi-sensory way. So you're using, for some learners, the identification of the word and the colour might be really helpful. You know, for everyone, it might just be a fun way of doing it, and that's a good example of inclusion. But for some learners, this may be a must-do as well, you know, because it really, really helps. They're moving around the class, so you're doing what I often call a bog standard kind of learning activity, but doing it in ways that are different and ways that might be really meaningful for everyone, but especially for some. And so that's just another example. Okay, we're going to move on to the last section here is assessment for learning. And now this is assessment for learning, not assessment of learning. And now assessment of learning is what sure we all do all the time. You know, we teach, and then at the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the term, they have assessment, they have a test. And what I'm talking about is something different, is how do we support our learners and how do we gauge our learners in ways that they can focus on their own learning, which can actually support what they will do in a final assessment or a progress test as well. Now, the point about assessment for learning, and as you can see the points that I've highlighted on this slide, it's ongoing, but it's not just about ongoing, it's also about learners learning as individuals, but also learners working as part of a class and working with others in the class as well. You know, it's about having not just one answer, but have more open-ended possibilities as well. You know, it involves learners in setting their own goals, and fundamentally, again, it's giving you know, it's actually supporting learners and credit for what they can do rather than for what they can't do, which is a theme of all of this. We'll look at something called self and peer assessment. You know, but again, it's very much about assessment in terms of progress as well, and not just final outcomes. You know, and I think that's what's really important. Now, I think this really matters because, you know, we talk about inclusive practices and you can do all the wonderful inclusive practices in the classroom and in teaching and learning, and then you give, and as you see from this image, you give somebody a standardized test. And in a sense, unless we actually include inclusion in our ways of assessment, then we're never going to actually achieve anything in terms of inclusive practices. And this is, you know, just you can see from this image, you know, class all year long, I've taught each of you to learn at your own pace in ways that's personal to your style. I've set goals for each of you, and you work individually and you work together, and you know, you all enjoyed yourself. Now you're going to have a standardized test. And kind of if we do that, you know, one side, which is assessment, is laughing at the teaching and learning inclusive practices, and Now, some tests you can't do anything about, and we know that, and it's set from outside the school, or even if it's set inside the school. But there are things that we can do as teachers in the classroom that can change that. And even the things we do in the classroom can actually support our learners and when they get to having to do the standardized tests that can't be changed. So if you look at the next slide, and here we've got examples, and here we've got an image of there's learners here who are giving examples of how they can actually support their learners, their own learning, and ways of doing this, and you can read these different ways. In the first session, we had that image of everyone having the same being equal, and how we pointed out that was not really a way of supporting everybody, and so if you look at the image on the left hand side, it's a very good example. There's animals who've got a test. And the task they have to do is to actually climb that tree. Now, the monkey might excel on that. The elephant might find that as a challenge. The fish would find it impossible to do. and so I think what we need to look at here is what we want. We're not talking about any reduction in standards. We have high aspirations for our learners, but we are actually working towards how can we achieve the same learning outcomes, but maybe in different ways? And as often been said, if you give a fish a task to climb a tree, it'll go through life thinking it's stupid, and I think that's important. One other aspect of it is what's often called bell curve, and we often put learners into this middle bit of bell curve, that this is what normal learners should do, and it divides learners into normal and not normal. And I think we have to get away from this. And again, this falls into this camp of prejudging, what our learners are going to achieve. Now, I'll just go through a whole number of things, which is actually quite visual, and we don't need to spend a long time on, but I'll show you. In the previous session, we looked at something called an individual learning plan. And now that was a plan that was given by the school and teachers. This is an alternative version that learners can actually develop their own individual learning plan. And so they can look at things that they do well, they can put in things that are challenging, things that can help them, to support them. It might be here what I like about my teacher, it might be many other things. And the following slide is another example of how they might develop their own individual learning plan. And I think that's something that can be, it comes from them, but it's kind of negotiated and talked about with you as a teacher as well. The next slide just goes through some of the elements of assessment for learning, which is about sharing, which is about getting feedback, asking questions. Of course, the more you can ask questions, the more you're going to get answers. It's about self-assessment and peer assessment. On this next slide, and this is something that's often not incorporated into assessment, does assessment always have to be academic? Are there other ways that we might want to assess the progress that our learners are actually achieving? And a lot of these fit into kind of the emotional needs of our learners as well. Now, we often talk about the importance of, we're actually preparing learners for what they're able to do once they leave school. So I think of all of these things, can we actually bring this into assessment? Because some learners may make great progress, on things which are less academic as well. And I think that's really important. The next one, for a lot of learners, I mean, of course, if you ask learners to plan their own lessons, they say, well, where do we start? And so there might be ways we can help and structure with that. And here's just a little schema that might help, which is putting it into 4 little boxes. Now, this is often used outside of school in business, but I think this can be used in schools as well. So the first box would be, what's important and essential? How do we break down our learning? And you know, that green box that's going to really matter, and it's probably what's really going to be in the final test as well, or the progress test. So we've got to do that. Yeah. Are there some things that are important but not essential? So really good to do, but maybe it's not quite as important as in the green box. Are there things that are important but not essential? And then are there things that are not important and not essential? Because not everything that's actually taught really needs to be worked on. And that just might be a helpful way of structuring. Okay, so let's go on and look at a few other ideas for what we mean by, and we often call it A4L, assessment for learning. And you know, some of these can be very, very simple, and just help a learner. And certainly it can help you as well to understand what the learner's learned, but very much help the learner as well. If we look at this next slide, again, using this kind of metaphor of using the green, amber, red, you know, it might be a learner could maybe have a card as well that they can actually just show to say whether they're understanding something or whether they're not understanding something, or whether they're partially understanding. And that could be really good feedback. I mean, other learners as well can see what other learners understand, but you can see where the learner is. You know, maybe a very simple thing, if you see in this slide as well, just thumbs up and thumbs down, or just thumbs across. Again, whether they do understand, don't understand, or partly understand. It just gives information. It's just, you know, another way of looking at this is just lots of different ways of getting feedback, really. Yeah. You know, you might do something with the 5-star fish, where they're just putting an idea on each of the 5 parts of the fish. It might be, you know, it's putting words on a fish as well. One other thing you can do, which is quite nice as well, to get away from the academic as well, is to you can have a fish on a card, and it might be that you on the fish you just put some nice thoughts about how you've worked with somebody, or how you felt about the day, or if you're working in groups, or just somebody else in the class, and give somebody a fish. And it's you know, it's just a way of giving your how you feel on that day as well, which I think is just, or how you feel about the person on that day as well. Now, you might say there's a danger, there might be some nasty things said, but you know, if things are explained why you're doing this activity, then often it's nice thoughts flow from that. And it's, again, all these things are things worth trying, and see how they go. As we said in the first session, you know, we had this approach about assess, and that's assess the learning need, not the special need. Plan, do, review, and that's all we can really do. We can look at the learner's needs, we can plan, we do things, and then we review them. Yeah, and I think that's an ongoing cycle. In the next slide, again, something very simple. It's called 2 stars and a wish, which you might do, and that might be you know, for something they think they've done well, they can give themselves a star. They can, you know, if they're very happy about a really piece of work, then maybe they give themselves an extra star. Yeah. A wish would be something they would like to know more about and kind of improve on. They might even give you a star or 2 stars as well, or they might wish something for you. I think that's important feedback, and I think this is the important thing about this. This is assessment for learning. It's feedback for learning, and you know, anything that actually builds on that is going to be really good. Something else, if you look at the next slide, which is called the 3-2-1 approach, which might be useful. So three things I remember, 2 things I can use, and maybe I can use in another class if you know, if in another subject class or something like that. 1 thing that I wasn't expecting. And that's, that kind of structures. It's a helpful way of thinking about their learning. There's an approach called think, pair, share, which is also very, very useful. So think is you think about something yourself. Then you might go into a pair or a small group and speak about it, talk about it. And then which is a kind of expanding, so you're learning from somebody else as well. And then you might then be feedback in the whole class or the whole group. So, but it structures it. So this kind of think, pair, share is a useful approach as well. Now, these are all quite simple. They're beginning to get a bit more involved and complex. But let's look at two other areas, which is also quite interesting. If you look at this chart in blue as well, KWHL chart, this is called, and this is a way, and this example is just taken from, there might be a lesson on the Arctic and the Antarctic and what animals are there, and so this example is saying, there may be a lesson, and so what do I know about this? Well, I might know which animals might be in the Arctic and what might be in the Arctic, in the Antarctic. What more information do I need to know about the Arctic and the Antarctic and the animals that are there, polar bears and penguins and all the rest of it? And then in another box might be, well, how am I going to find out more information? Is that going to be a search on the internet? Is it books? Is it from the library? Might be something you can watch at home. Might be more information from what we do in the lesson. And then it's really how will I know what I've learned, and what I need to learn. So it's a whole kind of structure that starts from information and knowledge, but then goes really, well, how can I support my own learning? And how can other learners help me in supporting my learning? Now, another way of looking at it as well is what we call self and peer assessment. And we look at this next slide in the pink and yellow box. And now, in lots of classes in the UK, this is what actually happens. And at the end of a lesson, there are learners who will mark their own work. They'll give themselves a mark, not just for the knowledge that they've achieved in that lesson, but how they've behaved in the lesson, how they've interacted with others, and then there's another table, and in this case it's each one is 6 out of 10 or 4 out of 10 or whatever. It could be any range of marks. If your marking system isn't that way, if it's 1 to 5 or if it's letters, then obviously you choose what you do in your context. But then you also give that learner a mark for all these same areas. And now this needs to be worked on and supported, and learners need to understand what would a 6 mean, what would a 4 mean. So, and I think that's really important, and that's helpful for them as well to how they actually grade themselves. But what you find happens is that your mark and their mark is usually very close. Yeah? But I think what's most important is not whether your marks are close or not. And if you don't agree, then you will kind of look at that and say, well, no, I don't think you got a 6 for your behaviour. Can you look what happened in the class? Do you want to maybe rethink your mark or do you want to keep to that mark? Yeah. But I think the important bit of this is that it takes actually the marking system away from it's only me as a teacher who can mark. That it gives actually learners a big say in their own assessment and their own marking, and I think that's much stronger than what the actual mark is as well. And I think this is something that really helps to build it's that learners feel that they're in a kind of partnership in the classroom. They're actually working with other learners and teachers. So it can be other learners can mark other learners as well. Yeah? And it creates an important sense of kind of responsibility in learning, which I think is really, really important. Okay, on the next slide again, it's just another way of looking at it. You might want to structure it, and these are kind of scaffolding ways of using it as well. As something I've learned, something that I wasn't expecting or surprised me, something I'd like to think more about, or something I'll use in another situation and context. Okay, so that's our 5 frameworks in this session that go together with the five frameworks in the previous session. And as you can see on the slide here, we have all 10 frameworks, and we have it in a visual pie chart here as well. Now, I like to call this a pie because these 10 are kind of separate slices of the pie. And what the way I'd like to look at those 10 slices is see it as a big pizza or a big pie. Now, if you ate all of that at once, you might get indigestion. If not, you'd be actually sick. So maybe you have to kind of look at how much of this pie do I want to use. And of course, they all, as you can see from the various ideas, that they're not totally separate, and they kind of interlink with each other. So I think that the idea is that, can you take a slice or 2 or 3 and see how can I work with that in my classes, what kind of activities can I bring in to try and show that I'm using those bits of the pie, and maybe over a whole term or maybe over a year you might use the whole pie. But I think the important thing is that it's bit by bit. When we talk about inclusion, we talk about how do we make our classrooms and our schools more inclusive, and I think that's what's really, really important. What are the steps we can take? Some might be small steps, others might be much bigger steps, but it's a step-by-step approach. And the reason why inclusion matters is because if you look at it the other way around, it's exclusion really matters as well. And exclusion leads to underachievement and failure. We want to use the best brains of everybody in a kind of learning process. And that's why inclusion is important, because it actually leads to better outcomes for everyone. Okay, just to end here with a few slides. And now the next slide is, I would say, as well as looking at it from the perspective of the pie, we have six areas here which I think really matter. So what we call using inclusive practices with our best endeavours is what we often say in the UK. So I think we need to have high aspirations for ourselves and high aspirations for our learners. If we have that and we work with that, then we'll achieve the best we can. We have to be realistic as well, and we can't do everything. But if we do everything to our best endeavours, we're going to reach the best outcomes for everyone. Assessment for learning, as we've talked about, and trying to individualise and differentiate as much as possible. Using multisensory approaches, and as I say, all this based on high aspirations. I think one thing we haven't really talked about yet, but I think is really, really important, is that even in the English classroom or the foreign language classroom, the use of all languages, I think, is actually very, very important as well. I think the days of English only in a class, an English language class, is quite not just out of date, but just not effective. And I think there's lots of ways that we can, in a positive way, and if we've got learners who've got different first languages, that we can use the strengths of their first languages as well in the classroom. And the last one is what I call KISSE. And it's about a kiss. It doesn't mean you have to give all your learners a kiss. That's a question of choice, or whether it's even allowed. But it stands for keep it short and simple. But I've added an E, and that E is keep it short and simple enough. I think that's important. Keep it short and simple, but that element of challenge must always be there for all learners in order to achieve whatever whatever that is and whatever level that is. And just to finish with the final, as you see, this kind of final thought, if you like. And this is really what inclusion is all about. And it's, if you see a flower growing here, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows. You don't try and change the flower. And I think that's, if you want a message about what we mean in terms of inclusive practices, that's it.